Everyone, I'm Bruce Karasek, co-founder of the Jewish Republican Alliance. We're so happy to have Newt Gingrich here with us today. We'll be talking with the speaker in just a few minutes. We're also broadcasting live on Facebook to about 10,000 people. We've got a large number of people on the Zoom call, so we're excited to get started. But first, today is September 11th, 2020. It's now 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. 19 years ago on this date, the Pentagon had already been attacked at 9:37 a.m. Flight 93 had already crashed into a Pennsylvania field at 10:03 a.m. And at 10:28 a.m., both of the Twin Towers in New York had been hit and both had already collapsed. 2,977 members of our American family had died in an instant. And America was saddened, angered, and shocked that such a horrible attack on the U.S. could happen. I remember looking at my wife with a tear in my eye and saying, you know, that our lives in America will never be the same exactly again. People will forever think in terms of life before and after this day. But what many people do not know, that 2 years before 9/11, Newt Gingrich served on a blue ribbon panel on U.S. national security in the 21st century. The commission concluded that a significant terrorist attack could hit the U.S. And Speaker Gingrich went on TV just a few days after 9/11 and told Dan Rather that the -- recommendation from that committee was that America must be prepared for an attack on U.S. soil. And the one that attacked us on 9/11 was, as horrible as it was not the big one. Their fears were chemical, biological, and nuclear being used in an American city. Speaker Gingrich said that it was recommended that we form a Homeland Security Agency. He warned that 9/11 was just a possible precursor of what potentially could happen 15 to 20 years in the future. Speaker Gingrich went on Fox News on September 16th, 2001, and said we need to add more resources to our intelligence community. We need better coordination between the FBI and the CIA. We need the U.S. Department of Agriculture to be there at every point of entry. We need Immigration Service to be checking your passports. We need customs people. He had a plan. He knew we had to be protected, and his central mission was keeping America safe. But Democrats today have forgotten the bipartisan unity that existed in America after 9/11. They have forgotten the risks that we all face. Instead, Democrats are so intent on bringing down President Trump at any cost, they have taken their eyes off the ball and distracted Americans from even a potentially bigger threat to our safety. They have risked the safety of all Americans by calling for open borders, by letting criminals free, by allowing violence to take place on our streets, and by using the coronavirus from China as a political weapon to get votes, rather than pulling together to solve this biological attack that has killed almost 200,000 Americans. I submit to you that this election in November must be about safety and security and heeding the warnings of Newt Gingrich both 19 and 21 years ago. I believe that we as Americans are a wise, brave, and free people, and I believe the policies of the Democrats must be abandoned by all Americans because the results of our election in November could determine the very survival of our nation. I want to thank you all for being here on this special day. And I want to introduce to you now my fellow co-founder, Mitch Silberman. Mitch?
Hello, JRA community. It is always so great when we are together. Did you know that our legal system has its origin in the Ten Commandments? And did you know that the main difference between the Magna Carta and the Declaration of Independence is that the former gives individuals rights as given to them and granted to them by the ruling class, whereas our cherished Declaration of Independence grants us rights from God. You see, if man gives you rights, then man can take away rights. And also, did you know that during World War II, the government issued 17 million Bibles to soldiers with a special message in there from General Eisenhower? Now, the reason I know these things is because I read an amazing book called Rediscovering God in America. you can take a guess who the author is. And this book is incredibly relevant, especially what we're witnessing today. We have one major party that thinks our country is bad and our founding is evil. We have the other major party, the one I like a whole lot more, that knows we are a good and decent country and that our founding was on moral principles. Our founding fathers knew that human nature does not change and that governments tend to become tyrannical. So they created the most exceptional and extraordinary country that created the biggest force for good the world has ever seen. The concepts of freedom and electing leaders who represent us, who serve us, is an aberration in history. Now, many countries had, and some still have, slavery, but only America went to war with itself to end this atrocity. The hypocrisy, destruction, and yes, tyranny that we are witnessing today is sadly common throughout history, though we probably thought we'd never have it here. So embracing and enforcing the very reasons our country was founded is crucial to restoring law, order, and peace. And if our country is so terrible, ask others, why do people from all over the world literally risk their lives to come live here? Why do freedom fighters in Hong Kong proudly wave the American flag? And how come these America-hating Americans never seem to emigrate to other lands? Well, the answer is simple. America is the greatest country in the history of the world and remains the last best hope for mankind. America is indeed beautiful. So now more than ever, your conservative activism is needed to preserve the Judeo-Christian values upon which our beloved country was founded. And I'm going to leave you with a really important quote. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. George Orwell. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our very special guest, an intellectually fearless visionary and historian, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Newt Gingrich is one of the most foremost economic, social, political, and security-focused conservative thinkers today. He's well known as the architect of the contract with America that led a Republican Party to victory in 1994 by capturing a majority in the U.S. House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. Newt was also a Republican candidate for president of the United States in 2012. Mr. Speaker, welcome.
Well, it's great to be with you, and this is as important an election as we've had in my lifetime, and I think probably the most important election since Abraham Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864. Then the choice was so deep that his opponent, General McClellan, would have allowed the South to secede, would have accepted slavery, and would have dissolved the Union in order to get peace. So the gap between those two visions was enormous. I think this year you have the same thing happening with Biden and Harris representing a radically different view than Trump and Pence and McCarthy and McConnell. I also think if you look at our position in the world, whether it is the strength of our economy, which ultimately underlies all of our military capability, or the strength of our military, or the willingness to follow tough-minded policies. I was the author of the bill which would have moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I watched year after year as presidents, both Democrat and Republican, waved to doing it. There was a clause built in to get it signed by Bill Clinton that said presidents could waive it. And I knew that the State Department would always beg for them to waive it and not move it. When Trump came in, the world changed. All the old time, this is why there are a bunch of national security professionals who are never Trumpers, because he repudiated their lifetime of work. They all warned him, if you move the embassy to Jerusalem, everything will fall apart, there'll be riots, you'll isolate the Arab world. In fact, people didn't realize that and I give Jared Kushner a lot of credit for this, the very first overseas trip by Donald Trump was to Riyadh, where the Saudi king had assembled 58 Muslim countries, the largest Muslim gathering ever to meet with an American president, lasted 3 days. He also went to Rome, where he met with the Pope on the same trip. So it's pretty ecumenical. But what was fascinating was Trump understood that if he could reassure the Arab world, which had really gotten scared by the Obama-Biden appeasement of the Iranians, and was very worried. In fact, one of the points that was made when Trump arrived in Saudi Arabia was that the king would never go to the airport to meet Obama, but he came to the airport to meet Trump. And I talked to Trump when he was in Rome. I called him, and he said, you know, the king was with him for 3 solid days every time he was in public. So imagine the amount he was learning as this brand new president. But his source wasn't a Brookings Institution paper or a Center for Strategic and International Security Studies paper. His source was the king, which began to change a lot of things. So he checked with all of his newfound friends, and they basically all said to him, look, if you really want to move the embassy, we will indicate that we're going to put up frownies on Facebook, and that'll be about it. And so he moved the embassy. It didn't matter, other than the usual skirmishes with Hamas. It just didn't matter. They then went out and began strengthening their friends. And ultimately, the United Arab Emirates decided to take the lead. And for the first time in 25 years, you had a new relationship between Israel and an Arab country. And in some ways, this is a very refreshing and interesting relationship because it began with a flight from Tel Aviv to the United Arab Emirates, and the really aggressive decision that they would open up economically, militarily, with intelligence sources. So you really are seeing a dramatic shift in the balance of power in the region, and you're seeing it done by the president with minimum American direct involvement. And I think you have to ask yourself, you know, the way I put it to people, and I'm sticking to national security because I think it's central to anyone who's concerned about the survival of Israel and the United States and Israel. I just tell people, if you have any doubt about this election, close your eyes. Imagine a meeting between Xi Jinping, who is the dictator of China, the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, very tough guy, between Xi Jinping and the next American president. Now, do you want a guy who's a little rough about the edges, but knows a lot about negotiating? Or do you want a guy who falls asleep halfway through the meeting? And that's really where we are. I mean, I think it is, historians will look back and marvel that the Democrats would nominate Biden when he's so clearly incapable of doing the job. I mean, he couldn't possibly be commander-in-chief. And whether that means, you know, that Dr. Joe Biden would be running the country, or it means that Kamala Harris would be running the country, it's very unlikely that Joe Biden will be running the country. So anyway, that's a sweeping overview. I think an immense amount is at stake. I hope everybody who's involved is going to get everyone they know to go vote. This is the most important election of your lifetime. And well, I think it'd be more fun if we could open up to questions and let the audience define what we're going to talk about.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my opening remarks, I talked about Democrats not heeding your warnings of both 19 and 21 years ago, and how it's get President Trump at any cost. What are your thoughts on my comments and how that will affect the election?
Well, I mean, I think that the whole issue of security and safety, whether it is having the main street of your town trashed by looters, or it is the threat of terrorism, or it's the threat of the rise of China, all of those things ultimately help President Trump, because he represents a very pro-American position and a very tough-minded position, and people know that. I think one of the reasons I thought that we got Clinton was that the Cold War had ended, and people felt they could sort of go on a vacation. And so they didn't really apply national security tests in that period. I think now we're back into a dangerous world, and I think that broadly helps the president. I do both a free podcast and a free newsletter at Gingrich 360. And 2 weeks ago, I wrote a newsletter that the Democrats have become the Lion King party. And the point I made was that The Lion King is a wonderful movie, but it's a movie in which lions and zebras and warthogs are all good friends, and they all sing and dance together. And that everybody who knows the real world knows that in fact lions eat zebras and warthogs. But the Democrats actually believe that The Lion King is a documentary. And so whether it is the pro-criminal, anti-police district attorneys that George Soros is helping elect in the US, or it is in their approach to Iran, where they actually thought sending $1.6 billion in cash would somehow gain the affection of the dictatorship. Instead, of course, they just increased their contempt. They thought guys dumb enough to send them that much cash were clearly stupid. And I think we need to recognize that if you believe the world is real, the only plausible candidate in this election is Trump. If you believe that, in fact, The Lion King is a documentary and lions and zebras and warthogs can dance together, then Biden's probably a reasonable choice, because in a world where there is zero danger, the fact that Biden is incompetent wouldn't be a big threat.
That's a brilliant analogy, Mr. Speaker. Really, I love that. You have been with some of the brightest and best politicians in the second half of the 20th century, and I would put you clearly in that category as well. Where would you rank President Trump and his political abilities and instincts?
I was thinking about this the other day because I was talking to somebody about, I've worked and known 7 presidents personally. And then, of course, I've known Pelosi, and I knew the House reasonably well. I think the thing that's so hard to get across, in which the news media has, or the propaganda media, which I would call it, has no interest in understanding, is that Trump doesn't fit any models. He didn't go to Harvard or Yale. He's not a lawyer. He didn't spend his career in politics. He doesn't surround himself with intellectuals who write fancy papers and have lots of PhDs. He is a hard-bitten, golf-playing, entrepreneurial person who, I try to remind people, he was on the construction side of real estate, not the finance side. So while he clearly was very good at getting money out of bankers, he didn't, get up in the morning and put on a fancy outfit to go down and hang out on Wall Street with people with lots of money. He went out and saw the blue collar workers, and he checked things out. There's a great YouTube series that you can pull up that is about 1998, and it's Trump doing all the jobs in one of his hotels. So you have Trump in a bellman's uniform, and at one point he's walking a dog for one of the, and he brings the dog back, and the lady, and he says to the lady, "Do I get a tip?" I mean, just another point, one of the maids is showing him how to clean out a room and how to make the bed, and another point, he's standing behind the counter welcoming people and registering them. But he does all the major jobs in a hotel. And that's so different than the normal run-of-the-mill kind of people that we think of as president. So I don't think you can compare him in any practical way. I would argue he is the most effective president, with the possible exception of Reagan. He's the most effective president at getting things done, that he is a clearly disruptive figure, that he is an outsider, that a great deal of the hatred he arouses is legitimate because he's destroying their world. I always tell people, it's not that Trump is a great conservative. He's the most effective anti-liberal I've ever seen. And that's very different than being conservative.
Mr. Speaker, when in 2016, I saw you at the Reagan Library, which is probably about 10 minutes from my house, and you boldly predicted in 2016 that President Trump would beat Hillary Clinton and be elected. So my family and my friends who are conservatives are asking me, what is your prediction for 2020?
Well, if your friends and their friends vote, he wins in a landslide. If they go home and relax, he wins narrowly. But in either case, he ends up winning. I think the Democrats have, I think, made a whole series of enormous mistakes that people will write about later on. The first is they sort of sleepwalked into nominating somebody who's literally sleepwalking. There's no candidate that I can remember, certainly not in modern times, who is as personally weak as Joe Biden. Yesterday, he forgot which year 9/11 occurred in an interview. He talked about it having occurred in the year 2000. The other day got totally wrapped up talking about NAFTA and said that he voted for NAFTA because President Bush made him do it. And of course, NAFTA was passed when Bill Clinton was president. I mean, just go through this whole series of things. The second thing is they picked as the vice presidential nominee the worst vice presidential candidate in modern times. I think you have to go back to Tom Eagleton, who dropped off of the McGovern ticket when it turned out he'd had electroshock treatments for depression, and people weren't ready for a president who'd been through electroshock treatments. But Harris had 15% of the vote when she started and 4% when she dropped out. She ranked fourth among with African Americans, and Biden had 8 times as many African American votes as she did. She was running fourth in California, and 61% of Californians thought she ought to get out of the race. I mean, why they picked her is beyond me, because she is really, I think, a extraordinarily weak person. And I think she's very radical. I just did a podcast at Gingrich 360, which I think we may have put up either yesterday or today, which is just her own voice. And I introduce her, and then you hear her say something really radical. Then I introduce another thing. She says something really radical. But we deliberately did it so you can't say, oh, Newt Gingrich is making this up. And so I think that she will end up being a disaster. I also think that none of us really had the nerve. I look back now, and I'm sort of kick myself. The degree to which their selection process was racist was amazing. And you're seeing this begin to show up with Hispanics, because Hispanics began to figure out, wait a second, if the only person who can apply is a black woman, then that means I can't apply. So the Democrats have ruled, if you're Chinese or Indian or Filipino or Vietnamese, or if you're Latino, you can't apply because you don't fit. And by the way, if you're a black male, you can't apply. And I think that kind of stuff, all of that has come together and ultimately will sink their campaign, which has you don't have to believe me now, it has the potential to become George McGovern in '72. I mean, as people really start thinking about all this stuff and realizing these folks are just crazy. It's not that they're left wing, it's that they're crazy. And crazy is really a dangerous thing to have in a president.
Mr. Speaker, I love the fact that you see President Trump winning no matter what. We want him to win in a landslide, obviously. What do you think the Democratic Party's next move will be should he win? I cannot imagine them saying, well, we gave it our best and, he's our president now. What do you think?
They already have a coalition of 60 different organizations, which has committed that if he wins, you'll have massive demonstrations in the street, you'll have efforts to occupy property, you'll have a tremendous level of civil disobedience, because the American people will have failed to do what the left wanted them to do. And I mean, they're very open about it. You can pull up articles, but they are planning right now. First of all, if it's close, they're planning to steal it. And they say this pretty openly. And second, if he wins by a decisive margin, they will repudiate the system which would have elected him. And they'll say, this actually started in 16. They were in such a state of shock. People forget, and I wrote about this in an earlier book called Understanding Trump. The first meetings to organize against Trump occur the day after the election in 8 different cities. The first article on the need to impeach Trump is April of 2016, before he's even nominated. I mean, I don't think we appreciate how the left, we are in a cultural civil war. The left is his mortal enemy, and 90% of the news media is the left. So the fact that Trump is still standing after 5 solid years of the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, et cetera, I think, you know, you want to talk about a guy who's both tough and obviously has some level of skills, because the very fact he gets up every morning and they still haven't beaten him down, I think is one of the great achievements in American political history.
You're right. I have a question from the audience. Adam M. is asking, Newt, how concerned are you about the absentee, I call it cheat by mail, absentee and mail-in ballots and the early voting, and how that will affect the election and the outcome?
Well, I'm not at all concerned about absentee ballots, because we know how to do it. Every state's been doing it for years. That's how military people vote, for example. But an absentee ballot means that a real human being has asked for a ballot. They then sign it and verify that they did it. They send it back in a sealed document. So you have sort of a chain of evidence all the way through that this one ballot represents a real person. And you can check them off the voter rolls. What I worry about is this mass mailing that is essentially unrequested. So in Nevada, for example, the Democratic legislature and the Democratic governor decided that they're going to send a ballot to everybody, whether you request it or not. The post office has already told them in writing that there are, because Nevada's a rapid turnover state, there are 200,000 names that will be mailed a ballot who don't live in Nevada. Well, those are all going to land in some apartment complex or some nursing home. And the Culinary Union, which is the strongest single political force in Nevada, will be delighted to go and collect the extra ballots and vote them. I mean, it is an absolute invitation to a disaster. Nancy Pelosi passed a bill called HR 6800, which I did a whole series of podcasts about. And it has several sections which basically lay out and design how to steal an election. You don't have to prove who you are. You don't have to prove where you live. You don't have to have anybody else verify it. They go down literally step by step. If you wanted to guarantee a wide open election that a machine could steal, the Pelosi bill creates it. Now, it didn't go anywhere in the Senate, and this year at least we're okay. But one of the reasons I worry about them winning this fall is I think they'll try to rig the game so we won't have another honest election in my lifetime.
Excellent. Mr. Speaker, we have so many questions from the audience. This one's particularly intriguing, from Glenn C. Who is controlling the Democratic Party? Did they pick Harris because she's easy to control? Who's pulling the strings here?
Well, I don't know. First of all, American political parties are strange organisms, and they're not easy to control in the European sense. My guess, and it's purely a guess, is 2 things happened. One is in the peak of the emotion during the whole Black Lives Matter cycle, they decided they had to have a Black woman. So that means you eliminate all the men, then you eliminate all of the women who aren't Black, and you get down to a pretty small pool of talent at that point. Second, I think they like the fact that she can raise huge amounts of money. Right. She has Silicon Valley, she has Hollywood, she has really good ties in New York. She's one of those candidates who the voters may not like, but she can raise enough money to drown you, so she's going to win anyway. And I think that was a part of it. And then I think also, this is again what makes Trump so different. I think among elites, Kamala Harris is okay. I mean, she's dishonest and she's arrogant and she's, a lot of things, but not any more so than the rest of the elites. But among normal people, she's a disaster. And that's why I cited the fact that she started at 15%. I originally thought that she had great potential and said so. Now, if you can go back and pull up me on Hannity or Fox and Friends or something, and I'm saying, I think she could easily be the one who gets through. The more I watched her perform, the more I realized it's like somebody who can't hit major league pitching. I mean, I don't care how good they look in uniform, they ain't going to last. And she couldn't hit major league pitching.
We have a question from Leonard G., Mr. Speaker. He asked, how bad is the Woodward interview going to hurt President Trump, or if at all? Woodward, the book that just came
It won't have any effect at all. I mean, first of all, you have Fauci immediately saying that what Woodward wrote wasn't true. So you can decide, do you believe Dr. Fauci or do you believe Bob Woodward? Second, you have people saying, well, if it was true, then Woodward has been sitting on it for several months. So if he thinks it really mattered, why did he allow the country to not know this thing? And he gets all bogged down in, what he's doing. But in addition, if I run into you and say, the top investigative editor of the Washington Post, who's been at the Washington Post for his entire career, doesn't like Donald Trump. I mean, would you say, oh my God, what a great story? Or would you go, well, of course. How can he go to work every day at the Washington Post and like Donald Trump? So I think it becomes sort of one more left-wing smear effort by one more anti-Trump reporter. And the Trump base is now just fed up with it. I mean, they all get it. And then I think second, if you're the average independent voter trying to make up your mind, you worry about COVID, you worry about jobs, you worry about China, but it's a long way down before we get to whether or not Bob Woodward matters to you.
Very true. Mr. Speaker, we have another question from David B. And it says, whether we like it or not, it appears the coronavirus will be one of the most significant issues in the election for many voters. And wondering how the Trump campaign can take control of this narrative on the issue.
Well, I watched the president in Michigan last night, and I thought he did a pretty good job. I think what they have to do is just keep telling the truth. But the fact is, when Trump announced that he was cutting off the flights to China, Biden called him xenophobic. Nancy Pelosi ran down to Chinatown. Everybody on the left was saying, we don't need to be hysterical. And in fact, even some of his own advisors, I did a podcast with Fauci, who I've known since the mid 80s. And we did a podcast in early February. And if you go listen to that podcast at Gingrich 360, Fauci is saying, I don't really think this is going to be a pandemic. I think this is going to be sort of like, MERS or SARS or one of those, a little bit dangerous. You have to take care of it. And it's only about 3 or 4 weeks later that they begin to realize how bad it is because the Chinese had lied. They willfully, deliberately, methodically lied. And I think, so that part is going to be real. I mean, I look at a guy like Cuomo, who is one of the most dishonest people I've ever seen in public life. And he talks about Trump didn't do anything. Well, Trump sent them a Navy ship that could handle 950 patients. They rebuilt the convention center so it could handle over 1,200 patients. They sent 4 Army field hospitals. They gave them so much, and this is something that I think Trump's very proud of. In Italy, they ran out of ventilators, and they had to triage. And if you were over 80, they basically said, "We hope you get better, but we're not going to put you on a ventilator. You're just going to die." Not a single patient in the United States went without a ventilator, and we have since sent 16,000 ventilators around the world. Now, that was a free enterprise production model driven by an entrepreneurial CEO president. And I think they have to get their act together and tell this story so that it makes sense. Right? He's pretty good about it, but they don't really have a complete, they almost need to put together the COVID story and put it on TV and let people see it.
Mr. Speaker, we have a couple of questions regarding the mainstream media and education, both from Randy M. and Russ E. The question is, can you touch on the Democrats' indoctrination of youth by education and of the media and its historical parallels, and how do we counter that indoctrination of our youth? Because they're seeing it in the news, they're seeing it at school. Silence is now agreement, and they're being pressured to keep their mouths shut when they may think otherwise.
I tweeted this morning that now that we know we can stream schools, maybe we should adopt a rule that if you get federal funds, you have to stream your classroom so that parents can watch and actually see what you're teaching their kid. That'll be a starting point. I think also, and I just got involved in a fight in Washington University about a really destructive course they want to offer on how to overthrow the government. And I said, the president of Washington should be fired. I think that alumni have to step up to the plate. I think boards of regents have to step up to the plate. I think in public universities, the state legislatures have to step up to the plate. And my guess is that if Trump is reelected, as I expect he will be, that this whole fight over the nature of American education will be a major part of his second term.
Mr. Speaker, we have a pretty big question from Marcy S. Can you please address George Soros' involvement in what you think we're seeing erupting across America today?
Sure. For reasons I don't understand, George Soros seems to want to radically destabilize the United States. He has spent millions of dollars electing anti-police, pro-criminal district attorneys. He stands for a series of policies which, if they're enacted, will literally radically change America. Why he does this, I don't know. Life's been good to him. He's a billionaire. Freedom has worked out pretty well for him. And you would think, having grown up in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, that he would understand that being in a free country is a pretty good deal, and the rule of law is a pretty good deal. But he doesn't, for whether it's ego or whatever it is. Now, I will also say, and this is ironic, in talking with the Jewish Republican Alliance, the other day I did a tweet about Soros funding these anti-police, pro-criminal district attorneys, and I was promptly attacked as being anti-Semitic. And I came back and I said, well, the name of the guy who's giving the money is Soros. This is a fact. And I don't understand why defining accurately what somebody's doing would then be distorted, except that the left is so frightened of us looking into what Soros is doing. I mean, the current very, very conservative Hungarian prime minister made Soros the centerpiece of his reelection campaign and had big billboards that had Soros's picture and then a red slash across them. And he turned Soros into a massive liability.
Mr. Speaker, we have a question from Kim M. As a follow-up question to our discussion about the mail-in ballots. She says, thank you for your excellent leadership for all these years. What is your prediction regarding the mail-in ballots, ballot harvesting, and cheating? Do you think we will know the winner on election night?
I think if Trump wins by a big enough landslide, you'll know the winner. Biden will not, there's no likelihood at all that Biden will win by a big enough margin. And the Democrats have now got this weird thing going. They have been educating all of their voters into voting by mail and telling them, because of COVID, you shouldn't go to the ballot box and so forth. Republicans have gone the opposite direction. 83% of all Republicans want to vote in person, whether it's early voting or it's on election day, but they want to go and drop that ballot in, okay? Which means that the opinion polls, when the exit polls, are going to be massively pro-Trump. And the initial returns are going to be massively pro-Trump.
Hmm.
And I don't think the Democrats have thought yet into the psychology of all this, because then it becomes harder and harder to have opposition if the country comes to the conclusion this guy won. You know, what are you doing? So I think it'll be fascinating, but I do think in the long run we have to clean up the whole vote harvesting thing, because it's an invitation to I think having vote theft and vote fraud.
Completely agree. Mr. Speaker, can you talk to us a little bit about your recent book that came out in June, Trump and the American Future?
Yeah, I wrote the book because I thought that it was very important that we have sort of a handbook for the campaign. I thought this would be as important as it is, and I thought that the media would be as dishonest as it is. And so I wanted to have a opportunity to develop for Trump supporters and people who want Trump to win sort of a workbook on the election that gives them the facts and the figures and the information that lets them win the argument with their friends and neighbors and co-workers. And that's why I wrote Trump and the American Future. And I think I've had some people say to me, Hugh Hewitt said to me when he interviewed me that he thought it was the most important book I'd ever written, because he found it to be so helpful in framing and explaining the issues. So I cheerfully recommend Trump and the American Future to anybody who's interested.
We have a question from Marcy S. When Trump wins, what will happen with the riots? It's getting worse. And then she said, oy vey.
Actually, I think that this Operation Legend is beginning to really work. The murder rate in Chicago has been cut in half. Where they've arrested over 2,000 people. And I suspect that they will be fully prepared to deal with whatever contingency occurs starting on election night. And I think they're probably, right now you probably have the Justice Department, Homeland Security, and others actively working together to think through how to deal with this everywhere in the country.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how familiar you are with the Jewish Republican Alliance, but we're a national grassroots organization. Really, the only qualifications that you have to love America and love Israel. What words of inspiration would you give to our watchers, our listeners, our members, our audience about how important it is to get involved to make a difference?
Well, I think I'd start by saying that I presume most of your members have been to Israel. What people don't often think about, one of the great parallels, is that neither country is probable. There's no reason to believe in 1945 that you would still have Israel today, that it would be the most technologically advanced country in the region, would be the wealthiest country per capita, have the strongest military, and that its security would actually be increasing. Yet it is one of the great triumphs of the human spirit. Similarly, you can't go back to 1776 and imagine the United States today. It's a triumph of the human spirit. And I think in that sense, that love of freedom, that willingness to risk everything, that willingness to work extraordinarily hard, all those things I think are parallel for the two societies. And what I would say to everybody is really simple. This election is decisive. So you decide in the next 50 some days, how hard do you want America to survive? How much do you think the survival of a strong America relates to the survival of Israel? And then between your donations, your voice, your volunteering, you do everything you can based on the degree to which you think what I just said is true. I work on this 7 days a week because I think this is about my grandchildren and the country they will live in. And I think that I've been active now since 1958. And this is far and away the most important election I've ever been involved in.
Mr. Speaker, we have a question from Daniel H. He asks, what should be the president's second term priorities?
Well, I think he outlined them in a paper. I did a newsletter a couple of weeks ago called President Trump's Contract with the American People. he listed 51 different items. National security has to be one of the top 2 or 3. I think the second has to be education reform. If we do not fix our schools and we don't get to a point where people can learn and actually read and write and do enough math to have a job, we couldn't possibly compete with the Chinese. This is a genuine crisis of our survival, and it has been getting worse. I was, as a young member of Congress in 1983, I participated in the rolling out of Ronald Reagan's report called, my mind just went totally blank, A Nation at Risk. And A Nation at Risk was a study of education. And it began with the following. If a foreign power did to our children what we are doing to them, we would consider it an act of war. The truth is, the big city schools have gotten worse, not better. Children are being cheated every day. They're being trapped in poverty. They're being trapped in ignorance. And this is a genuine crisis of the long-term survival of our civilization.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I've noticed that Republicans stop voting on election day and Democrats stop voting until they win. We have a question here from, yeah, we have a question here from James B. How do we avoid another 2018 Orange County disaster where 6 Republicans win the night of the election, and then we wake up and a few days later, they all lose. A few weeks later, they all lose due to what I call legalized stealing, ballot harvesting.
You have to have enough lawyers and you have to have enough vote watchers. And you have to be prepared to take them to court. And I mean, the good thing, because of the clear theft of 2018, you have the largest Republican National Committee presidential campaign effort ever. In terms of lawyers already been hired, people already prepared. And I think you've also got a Justice Department, which is going to lock people up. And it's going to be, you know, people are going to run a real risk this year if they in fact break the law.
Mr. Speaker, the Jewish Republican Alliance is uniting and energizing conservatives to take action on behalf of America and Israel. We're now a national organization. Some of our events have had the largest gathering of Jewish Republicans in American history. We're all trying to fight this civil war that we're talking about, this cultural civil war, that in some cases have become violent. What advice do you have for our organization and how we can make a difference?
Well, I would say start with a willingness to band together and provide legal support for any student who is discriminated against because of their conservative beliefs, and begin to build a body of law that says we're going to sue the school. I'd start there. Second, I would say figure out among your broad membership, how many schools could you have working control in if the alumni from that system that belong to you, the Jewish Republican Alliance, got together. In the case of Washington and Lee, I have some good friends who are so angry, they're actively organizing the alumni, and they're putting all their money into a trust fund and saying basically, until this guy's fired, we're not giving you a dime. And those things have an impact. I would also say that it's important to start thinking about how you win control of school boards, and it's important to think about how you start winning control of state legislatures. And you do it with people who are determined to take on the left-wing education establishment and using the legal tools force change.
We have several questions I'll just combine into one. Obviously, we're very focused on who our next president will be. But what about the House and the Senate? Can you speak to that? Obviously,
Sure.
We would love to increase our size in the House and even, or I'm sorry, increase it in the Senate and take over in the House. But would you please speak to that, Mr. Speaker?
Sure. If as I said earlier, Trump is likely to do very, very well, we will probably have +2 in the Senate, and we have a 50-50 chance of Kevin McCarthy becoming Speaker of the House. And I think it's a function of, this is the kind of election where Pelosi took 207 Democratic House members and got them to vote for H.R. 6800, which would have given a $1,200 bonus to every illegal immigrant for having been able to cross the border illegally. Now, in those districts, if those candidates will pay attention to that, by itself, that will peel votes away because it's a sign of a level of radicalism that's not sustainable.
Mr. Speaker, we have several questions from people.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to leave it at that. So
Okay.
go ahead.
Last question.
One last question.
Okay. Thank you. We have several people that have asked about your relationship with President Trump over the years and anything amusing or interesting that you can tell us about the man.
Well, I mean, all I can say is Clifton and I have known him for many years. He and I campaigned together for Romney in Las Vegas in 2012. We belonged to Trump National in Washington, and would occasionally he'd come down by himself. And after we got done golfing, we'd join him for dinner and sit around and chat. He is a great storyteller. He's also a very good listener. And the last time we saw him, he was president. We'd gone out just for an afternoon of golf, and he saw that we were there. And they sent word that he wanted to see us, so we waited till he got off the course, and he came over and he said, "Why don't you guys join me for lunch?" And you obviously say yes to that invitation. And he said, "And by the way, I want Callista sitting next to me. I don't care where you sit." Just but he kept offering her his French fries, which I mean, watching my wife take the President of the United States' French fries is worth the afternoon. So, but he's a very personable guy. He's also very tough. He's extraordinarily smart. One of the things the media can't bring itself to understand. You don't beat 15 other Republicans, Hillary Clinton, the national news media, without being pretty darn smart. And he is. So it'll be interesting to watch him in the next 50-some days. Because you have a very smart guy who is the incumbent president, who is determined to not lose. And my guess is he won't. Okay?
Mr. Speaker, thank you for being
thank
here.
everybody on. Now, let me just thank everybody who's on for being committed and being involved. It really, really, really matters to have active citizens who are willing to participate and to do the things that the country needs.
Newt Gingrich's new book, Trump and the American Future, Solving the Great Problems of Our Time. We have shared the link. We're posting the link.
Right.
We suggest everybody go and get that book and read it. There's a lot of great information in it. Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much.
If you want more information, everybody, about the Jewish Republican Alliance, or you'd like to become a member or make a donation of any kind and any amount, just go to jewishrepublicanalliance.org. And now more than ever, we need your support to continue our great mission of uniting and energizing conservatives to take action on behalf of America and Israel. Today, we were on Facebook Live to our almost 10,000 subscribers. We wish you to go there and get involved in our organization. We're here to give you ammunition and make a difference. So we encourage your support, and we encourage you getting involved with our organization. You can also go to see any of our past shows on our YouTube channel, so we invite you to subscribe to that. You can also see us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So until we meet again, we wish all of you a very peaceful Sabbath. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and we will talk to you real soon. Have a great day.
Shabbat Shalom. Have a great weekend.
Shalom.